Are you all in chat box? What was the last discussion that we were having just before the break? We just completed a probability sampling techniques where we discussed about the simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, and cluster sampling, right? So this is what we have discussed. And now we will proceed for a non-probability sampling technique. Again, just to recall back the differences between probability and non-probability sampling technique. In probability sampling technique, every individual had an equal chance of being selected in a group. Right? In non-probability sampling, every individual may not have an equal chance of getting into the group. It all depends on the researcher's decision, right? The second difference is that whenever we consider about the probability sampling technique, right? So we will be having the basic assumption is that the researcher deals with the finite population and also researcher has the sampling frame with him. Whereas when a non-probability sampling technique are to be applied, the researcher is not aware about the population size, whether it is a finite or infinite. So generally it will be an infinite population and there will be an absence of a sampling frame. Now that we have understood simple random sampling, systematic sampling, the stratified and cluster, and the difference between the cluster and the stratified also I have already discussed. Now we will proceed further to discuss a non-probability sampling techniques, right? So among the non-probability sampling techniques, we have 4 prominent ones, that is a convenience sampling, judgmental sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. Again, friends, let me remind you, when we deal with all these 4 techniques, we do not have a sampling frame with us, and we are dealing with an infinite populations, right? Now, firstly, we will consider the first and foremost, everyone's favorite. What is it? Convenience sampling technique. And what is a convenient sampling technique? Here the researcher chooses the respondent for his study based on the researcher's convenience, right? So it's as simple as it is. Whenever the researcher finds some sample and if he thinks that that person has to be included in his study, then he will make a decision of choosing that particular person for a study, and that is a convenient sampling process. Am I audible, sir?
Yeah, madam.
Okay.
Audible.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, the convenient samples are generally their own friends, they're the researchers' friends, researchers' neighbors, family members, the colleagues, or anybody a passers by. So this is what exactly the convenience sampling method is all about. And when normally people tend to conduct these type of select these type of sampling methods, whenever somebody wants to know the review about a Kantara movie, right? So you just stand outside the theater and ask people on a random basis. Whoever is coming out of the theater, you tend to assume that the person has watched the movie and you're telling to you're trying to take a review of the persons and or an opinion about the person. So this is where exactly a convenient sampling. There is no database. We do not have a database, or the organization do not collect the database, or there is no sampling frame readily available to the researcher. So researcher collects the data based on his convenience. Or whenever you're walking, whenever you're on a walking, or when requesting the people to take a test products or consumer behavior studies, where exactly you would, whenever you're shopping, people tend to ask some questions with you. So these are all a convenient sampling. And advisable not to use these methods in your general social science research, but however, they play a very major role in a market research which are exploratory in nature. If you want to collect an ideas, insights, or hypotheses, then you can always use a convenient sampling, but suitably this particular method should not be used for a descriptive or a causal research, right? So these are, but definitely you can use this for the pilot studies. You can use it for pre-testing the questionnaires and so on. So this is your convenient sampling. Judgmental sampling. So as the name itself means, what is a judgmental sampling? That is, researcher is tending to use his own judgment or his own pre-existing knowledge or his own professional commitment or a professional judgment. So if a researcher tends to pose his own ideas, his own judgment, then it's a judgmental sampling method. And this is by default also called as a purposive sampling or a deliberate sampling method. So you can see from this picture, you have a large number of gathers. In between is a researcher. Researcher chooses the person based on the judgment. As I told you, if I want to know, if I want to study an income and saving habits of a fisherwoman, I go to the fish market. I make a judgment that the lady who is with a basket of a fish or dealing with the activity of buying and selling of a fish, I understand that the lady is a fisherwoman, and I can make a judgment and they collect the samples. So this is called as a judgmental sampling approach. Now, say for example, a researcher is interested in studying about learning why people wear glasses, or some silly studies I've taken here. So how a researcher uses the judgment sampling approach, the person who are with the glasses, whether they use it for the reading purpose or any other purpose, he tends to make a judgment that that particular sample should be included in the study. It is only a researcher's call, right? It is purely based on the judgment of the researchers. Again, these are all possible only when you do not have your sampling frame or a pre-list of your sample size, sample details with you. So this can be applicable. Again, a question: can you have a combination of judgment sampling and convenience sampling? Of course. If there is no right and wrong method, you can always mix up the sampling techniques. The third one is a quota sampling methods, right? Now understand one thing. Quota sampling is also similar to a stratified sampling. What did we do in stratified sampling? We divided the entire population into a stratas, right? The stratas where within the strata, the people are all homogeneous, but between the strata, they are all heterogeneous. But what was an understanding? In stratified sampling, we knew the sample frame. We knew the population was finite. But now in quota sampling, when you have your population as infinite, you do not have the list, but still you want to segregate the people on certain quota, right, or a certain groups, then you tend to go for the quota sampling. Do not get a confusion between a quota and stratified sampling, friends. In quota sampling, we are talking about an infinite populations. Let me take an example for this. So let us assume a company, a cigarette company, wants to find out which age group prefers what brand of cigarettes in a particular city. Right? Suppose if this is the study to be done, what does the researcher do? They apply on a certain groups, assuming that the age groups of 20 to 20, 21 to 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, and 50 plus, 51 plus. But do we have a real database of how many people do really smoke between the age group of 21 to 30? No. When your sample frame is not available, still you have a quota of 21 to 30 age group, 31 to 40 age group, 41 to 50 and more, then we tend to apply a quota sampling method. Now, to pick up the people from the strata of sampling, we had two techniques, which were the proportionate stratified sampling and disproportionate stratified sampling, where we made use of a standard deviation. But now we do not have any method of that. It is purely based on the researcher's call or on a personal judgment. You can mix up with the convenience sampling or judgment sampling to pick up the samples who are in between the age group of 21 to 30. Or you can, by looking at the per people also, you can make a few analysis of whether the really person the smokes or not. Based on that also, a researcher can take a call on this. The last non-probability sampling is called as a snowball sampling, right? Or this is also called as a referral sampling technique. Now, when exactly we people tend to go for a snowball sampling technique? When you identify one person giving the recommendation of another person, and it keeps going with respect to the chain referrals, then that is called as a snowball sampling technique, right? Now, this snowball sampling technique generally used when it is too difficult to identify the members of a desired population. For example, whenever we want to understand the, say in the workplace, how many people, if somebody is doing on harassment at a workplace, people will normally not open up and tell that they are harassed by higher ups or anybody, right? The workplace harassment. So you catch hold of one person and you understand that the person is harassed, and you try to connect to the person and collect the data information from them, and then ask for the referrals. Then the person is able to identify and give you the referrals, and it keeps going. Now, the basic drawback of this particular method is the time consumption. It may take a longer period of time for you to collect the actual data, but whoever will be included will be our right samples included for your study. And this is based on the network referrals. And so small sampling are very generally used in those kind of studies where it is very difficult to collect the data in one single, confined to one single populations, right? So these are the non-probability sampling techniques, right? Now, are you all ready for the activity? I was supposed to complete till here before the break. So never matter, we can finish it off now. So I want all of you to be active in the chat box. Are you all ready for the activity?
Yes, madam. They are very active.
Okay, I have 6 questions here. Now that you know what I have already discussed so far, right? So again, let me give you an overview, quick overview. I spoke about the 4th method of a sampling design. The first was identifying the target audience. Second was to identify the sampling frame. The third was to specify the sampling units. And the 4th one was to decide the sampling method. Under the sampling method, I had 2 techniques: probability sampling, non-probability sampling. Under probability sampling, what were the methods that I had? I had simple random sampling, systematic sampling, stratified sampling, cluster sampling. Under non-probability, I had convenience sampling, judgment sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. Is this clear to everyone? Now, when I give you an activity, right, I give you 6 different situations, right? I'm giving you 6 different situations. What you are supposed to do, you have to identify which technique that can be applicable here. Are you following this? Which technique that can be applicable here? Again, there is no right answer or a wrong answer. So it is again a researcher's knowledge which can tell you what can be the applicability of these techniques under a particular research base, right? Now, here you also must understand, when you take up this activity, first make an understanding whether I am knowing a population size N or not, right? That gives you a call to choosing the probability method and the non-probability method, right? I've given you the idea. So let's take up the first question. Are you able to read this quiz? Assume St. Aloysius College consists of 10,000 students divided equally among boys and girls. You want to select 1,000 of them for the further study. Suggest an appropriate sampling method. Quickly, I want the answers. What is there in your chat box? Stratified? Madam Lakshmi, did I tell that I want to select 1,000 people? Among them, there should be a boys and girls distribution. I have not made a statement, isn't it? I said out of 10,000 students, which has a group of boys and girls, I'm supposed to take only 1,000 of them for my further study. So the answer for this is a simple random sampling technique. I gave you an answer why it is not stratified. Suppose if I'm saying 1,000 people I select, there should be an equal composition of boys and girls. Then, of course, you are right that it should be a stratified sampling. Is this right? Then I need a thumbs up from all of you in the chat box. Is this right? Clear? Clarified? Yes? Okay. So we proceed to the second quiz. There is a residential locality where the residents comprise of Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Jains, and Christians. A survey is conducted to understand the food habits of the residents. Every 7,000 is selected as the sample. Which method is applicable here?
And he said systematic.
It is a systematic sampling method. Now, why did you get a confusion for a stratified? Because you said it is a Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Jains, and Christians. I agree. If I'm selecting us people from Hindu, Sikhs, Muslims, Jains, and Christians, then it is a what you said is right, that is stratified sampling. But I have a locality comprising of all these people. I have used a systematic sampling procedure where what did I do in systematic sampling? I have taken a sampling fraction. That is, if I'm supposed to take 10 houses, then 10 divided by the total number of houses, then pick up the random number in between and select every 7th house in chain. So it's a systematic sampling method, right? The next is the third quiz. Mr. X wanted to determine the spending pattern of the hotel guest. I request all the participants to little think before you give the answers, right? Once again, clarify the stratified sampling method. Sir, in class stratified sampling methods, we are dividing the population into certain groups. And from the groups, we are selecting the samples. That is your stratified sampling method. Now, why it is stratified? Because my population size is known to me. Is this clear? That is stratified sampling. Else it would have been a quota sampling. Now coming back to this question, Mr. X wanted to determine the spending pattern of the hotel guests, knowing that the business clients behave quite differently from the leisure guests. Which method? Okay, Steffi ma'am and Rosa ma'am, you have told me a non-probability sampling method, but please understand this is the data of a hotel guest. Is it not that the hotel will be having a database of how many guests that they are having it? So definitely it is not a non-probability sampling. So among the guests, people are able to determine the hotel is able to categorize the people as a business clients and the leisure guest, right? So among them, they are able to identifying the spending pattern. So it's purely a stratified sampling method. Vijaya sir, it is not a quota sampling. It would have been a quota sampling, suppose if the hotel does not have the database. But generally, when you log into the hotel, they will ask your databases either in the form of any kind of an identification identification cards, isn't it? So your database is already recorded. So this is your stratified sampling. Okay, a telephone company chooses customers to survey about its services. Again, think, does the telephone company, if they have to choose the customers, do they have the database? Do they have a database? Of course, they have a database here, right? From the database, they are choosing the people to call the customers on their services. So very true, this is a simple random sampling method, right? So this is a simple random sampling method. Next is a step, the question number 5. I guess this is the last one, maybe. Let me read it. So this is, a large zone was subdivided into 25 smaller areas. Then 5 of these areas were selected at random, and residents in these 5 areas were interviewed. Answer? Cluster sampling, right? This is a cluster sampling. This can also be a stratified sampling, but here the areas are divided into a cluster. So between the clusters, they are all same. Within the clusters, they are different, right? So here between the one area to another area, third area, fourth area, they're all likely same. So it's a cluster. Yes, of course, it can be a multi-stage cluster sampling, or it can be a single stage cluster sampling. So, but this is a cluster sampling. Again, it's a researcher calls to decide whether to give 1 stage, 2 stage, 3 stage, or a multi-stage. Sorry, more than 2 stage is considered as a multi-stage. Okay, I have one more question. Doctor surveys the patients in the waiting room one morning. Doctor surveys the patients in the waiting room one morning. So what do you say about this? Systematic sampling? Is he doing first customer, first patient, and then the 5th patient, or every 6th patient? No. Firstly, understand, if a doctor has, it's a non-probability sampling. Suppose doctor has a patients who are fixed based on the appointments, then you can go for probability sampling. If suppose randomly a patient walks into the doctor's clinic, and if he's surveying the people on a random basis, whoever walks into the doctor's shop, irrespective of their appointments, then it is a convenience sampling, right? It's a convenient sampling. Judgment sampling will definitely not come, because if a person is walking into the doctor's clinic, assumption is that the person is walked in for some reason, isn't it? For a medical health. So it is a judgment sampling does not come into a picture there. So it is a pure convenient sampling. Okay, I have only 6 quizzes, but the remaining quizzes I've given to you in the Google form, which will be shared to you at the end of this particular session. Okay, proceeding further, the last step. We have finished the first 4, and the last step, and the most important one, is determining the sample size, right? I hope you have enjoyed the quiz now. So we'll go to the last step, determining the sample size. Now the question for the researcher, right? So what should be the sample size that needs to be included in the study? Should I have 2 big samples or 2 samples? First and foremost thing, researchers should always think about what is the budget and time that is allotted for the research. Keeping that in mind, along with the objectives and the population study, population and the samples, keeping the parameter and the statistic within the frame, you have to take up a call on deciding the sample sizes. If you are having too much of resources, you can go for the big samples. When you have a limited resources, you can always go for the small sample sizes. But generally, when a researcher chooses the sample sizes, it can be a 10% of your population. It's an ideal thumb rule that normally people tend to give it. But statistically, there are various other methods, right? Sometimes you can use an arbitrary approach, that is a rule of thumb. Conventional approach, average of a similar studies. You try to do a literature review, and you understand in those literature review, they have taken an ideal sample size as so and so, and you can take up a call on that as well. That's a conventional approach. Cost basis approach, based on the availability of the resources, you decided. Or statistical analysis approach, that is taking a statistical considerations, that is keeping your average, that is knowing your parametric values. Based on that, you can take up, that is population size, population standard deviation, population average. Keeping that into consideration, you can decide it. Or based on the confidence interval, right? Whenever we are doing any type of a research, definitely I am 95% confident that my research will support my findings, right? Whatever the findings that I give it, I can be able to generalize it. But there's something called as a 5% of error in it, right? So if I'm 95% confident, there will be 5% of an error. 99% confident, 1% of an error. But generally in social science or management research, we use 95%. We do not go for 99%. That only goes with the medical science research, where the high probability chances of generalizing the result with the least amount of error, right? The least error should be very least. So that happens only with higher confidence goes with the medical science research. I'm talking about the social science research. So a most common method is a confidence interval approach method, right? So this is a method. Now, you may find, some of you may say that this is too silly. Why do we have to understand the theoretical background when readily we have that is a sample size calculator and so on? Of course, yes. But the beauty is to understand whatever you are giving in the research methodology of your research thesis. You should know how exactly you have derived about it. Simply taking some value from somewhere, you cannot include you cannot generalize it for your study, right? So always in confidence interval approach, we take 3 important reasons. One is population size, margin of error, standard deviation. Now the question, I said, do you know the population size always? Not necessarily, right? So the method to decide the sample size, according to the Cochrane, there are 2 basic methods. In a survey sampling methods, he decides there are 2 basic methods. One, calculate the sample size for the infinite population generally, and then adjust it for your population size. Friends, believe me, this is the standard method of deducing the sample size. Nowhere it is clearly mentioned, but I can support it with a lot of research articles, which normally I have done it for my research as well. But this is what exactly a researcher should know, right? Firstly, we find the sample size. There can be a consideration considered for the average, also for the proportions. The answers will remain the same, right? The formula is Z square sigma square by E square. Now, Z is a standard normal variate. That is for 95%, the standard values are 1.96, right? So for 90%, the standard, again, it's a theory. There is a different theory of how did you get that value 1.96, right? If I go on explaining, this class is not sufficient. This time is not sufficient. So assume that Z square, the standard value, as I'm talking about 95%, so it is a 5% of error involved in it. So standard score is 1.96. So sigma square, since it's an infinite population, I'm making an assumption that I know 50% of an information, so 0.50. Error we take because it's a 5%, so it is 0.05. Sometimes people want to have a confidence, but the margin of error to be lower. In those cases, you can take 3% or 2% allowable, right? So if I'm applying this, what is the formula? You can take a screenshot of this. It's 1.96 the whole square into 0.5 square divided by 0.05 square. I'm sure all of you know how did you get this now. Z square, the standard value for 95% is 1.96. Sigma square is a standard deviation. Since I'm having an infinite population, estimated standard deviation is 50%. So it's a standard value that we take it, 0.50. And error, since it's a 95%, I can take it as 0.05. So for an infinite population, 385 samples are an adequate samples, right? Now, everybody knows the theory till here, right? You knows the theory till here. You can apply the same thing with respect to the proportions as well. Say Z square into P into Q divided by E square. Q is nothing but 1 minus P, right? That is an estimated proportion. Again, P, we take the value as 0.5, right? So Z square as 1.96. And E square is 0.05, right? Again, you apply it, you get the same value as 384.16, right? So whether for any general studies, if your population is infinite, 385 samples, if you consider for your study, that is sufficient. Again, I'm making a claim that is sufficient to generalize your results to your population. I made my statement clear. I said you're taking 385 samples. Why you have to decide 385 samples? I am saying for an infinite population, if you take 385 samples, 385 samples are adequate enough to generalize your results to the population. Is this clear? So this is 385. But sometimes you may have to adjust your population values. Now, why do you have to adjust your values? Sometimes I may say, I want the school teachers from the whole of Karnataka, right? Database is not readily available, but if you go in real hunt of a database, you may get it. If you consider your population as infinite, you end up by taking 385 and finish off your study, right? But if you really know your population size, though it is a infinite population, you are able to get a sampling frame and get the value of your the sample sizes. Then you will have to use something called as adjusted sample size. I request all of you to take a screenshot again. So it is an adjusted sample size. What's the formula? So N is the decided sample size divided by 1 plus N minus 1 by N. So what is that capital N? Capital N is the total population size, right? That's a total population size. Put it in this, solve this, right? Either you can use a simple calculator. You get the adjusted sample size as 383. So what was the sample size that I had? 384, right? So when you're adjusting your sample sizes, you get 83. So finally, it is statistically validated for a population with the 1 lakh population. Your required sample size you have to consider for your studies 383 samples, right? So I have done this. This is what exactly is the methodology which people normally tend to not give in the research, but this is how exactly you need to give it. But in case if you have a pure infinite population, stop it in the previous step itself, right? So I'm sure all of you are clear about this, and that ends up the sampling design. So just to give you an overview of it, we started up with the discussions of a sampling, the language of a sampling theory, where we studied about population, sample, parameter, statistic, observations, and elements. Understanding these concepts, we defined what is called sampling inference, where statistical inference, sampling technique, right? We also understood, once we understood the sampling technique, we understood the methods involved in sampling design, starting with the step number 1, identifying the target audience, starting with the step 2, the identifying the sampling frame. Third, step 3, specifying the sampling unit. Step 4, identifying the probability method or a non-probability method. And step number 5 was determination of sample size. So this was my first part of a discussions. Now moving ahead to the second part, that is empirical tools for data collection. Now, I don't want to call it as a primary data, quantitative data, qualitative data, and so on. We will just talk about the data collection, right? So all of it, this has already been discussed in your previous days lectures, right? So generally, all of you know there are two basic forms of a data collection, which are segregated under the headings of external sources and internal sources. And under the external sources, you can segregate the data collection into two different categories, primary and the secondary, where you have already discussed about the secondary data on a first day and the primary data in during the sessions. But however, I'm here to give you an idea about what are the various tools that one can use to collect the primary data analysis, right? Now, internal sources, you all know what are the internal sources, the organizational records in the form of a sales, cost, customer feedback, distributors report, feedback forms, and so on, right? These are all internal sources where an internal audit happens. And then external sources. Suppose if you want to collect the data from the outside agencies, then it is an external sources. There are two basic forms of them. One is a primary and the second one is a secondary sources of data, right? I'm here to talk about tools required for the primary data collection. So my focus will be under primary data, a quantitative type of a data collection and the qualitative tools used for the collections, right? So I'm segregating my study into a quantitative research tools. That is, again, this is a primary data collection. Under primary data, in case if you want to collect the data where which deals with the quantitative values, that is which deals with the numerical values, then what are the tools that can be used for the research, right? So under the quantitative tools, the prominent ones are the personal interviews, then we have a telephonic interviews, electronic interviews, and then the self-administered interviews, right? Now, this is the broader method of collecting the data, which you can find it in any research textbooks, right? So primary data under the personal, you have an in-home methods, in-home personal interview technique, mall intercept. You go to the malls and collect the data. Why do we prefer a mall to collect the data? Because mall is a place which has a heterogeneous group of people. You do not, for mall is not only meant for the St. Aloysius College faculty members, isn't it? Mall is meant for anybody. So you can find a heterogeneous kind of a people and then you collect it. Then you make use of an instrument, a tool called as a laptops or a tabs or instead of a paper, you tend to use something as a tool, specified tool to collect the data. Either it could be your phones also to collect the data. So computer assisted. So you, as and when you collect the data, you are also feeding the data into your system. So these are your personal interview methods. Under telephonic method, we have a traditional telephone method where people call for the after sales services or reminder for the services, feedbacks, and so on. Then we have a computer assisted telephonic interviewing. Whenever you're giving a feedback forms or a customer care, when you call up, there is something called as a recorded voice and kept it. So that's called as a telephonic method. Then we have a self-administered method of collecting the data, a mail interview method, a older traditional method. Fax method, it happens only between the organizations or the places where you have a fax machine sharing for the data information. And then we have an electronic methods where we have email method and an internet method, which are very popular these days, right? So we will have an understanding of all these under the four broader headings: personal interviews, self-administered tool, the telephone, and the electronic. Again, friends, I'm not here to give you the primary data collection tools. I'm trying to give you what are the tools one can use to collect the primary data, right? So the first one is personal administered surveys, right? The first one is personal administered surveys. All of you know personal administered survey can happen with the face-to-face interviews. This is a very versatile, flexible method where the two-way conversation happens between the interviewer and the respondent. Now, again, you know what is a method of doing this, right? So whenever you are meeting and you are responding, firstly, you need to introduce yourself. You need to talk about your topic, brief outline of a topic, give the purpose, tell him the purpose, why exactly you want to collect his valuable information, and also assure the respondent that his information will be kept confidential, right? So this is a personal administered survey. Now the question, what is the tool that you can use to collect this data? Now here you can have a checklist. Here you can also have you can have a predefined questionnaire, or you can always have an unstructured kind of a questions, or based on one responses you can probe the answers, right? So this is a various methods of collecting the information from the personal interviews. Second is the telephone surveys. Definitely, what is the tool that you require? Telephone, right? So telephonic surveys are those surveys where you are not in direct contact with the respondent, right? You're not having a direct contact where you're able to see the respondents. So what can be the basic drawback here? When you are calling the respondent on a particular feedback, you do not have a clarity whether the actual respondent is giving you the answers or not, right? Sometimes there can also be a cases where you may not get connected to the respondent. There can also be a cases where the respondent may not entertain you to give the valuable feedback. So these are all the drawbacks that can have on the telephonic survey. But however, this is one of the popular method with it sitting in one particular place, with having their database of the phone numbers, you can reach out to the large number of a target audience. And of course, the telephone plays a very important role here. So again, you can make use of the two methods. One, a traditional telephonic interview methods where you call up and you have a database and you traditionally use one phone and call up the customer. Second one is a computer assisted interview. You have a recorded voice and try to get the connections to connect to the respondents through the recorded voice. The next one is a self-administered questionnaire, right? Now, self-administered questionnaire, in this, the important tool one must use is a questionnaire, right? Now, I am not sure whether the questionnaire in detail is dealt in the previous two. Can somebody give me a clarity on this? About the questionnaire is the...
Yeah, it was discussed in detail, madam.
Okay, it was discussed in detail. So I will give a outline in a surface level. Is that okay, sir?
Okay.
So I'm not going in very detail. If I have to talk about a questionnaire, you should give me 4 hours to talk about it, right? So that has so much of a content in it. But now what I will do is, since it's already, I assume that all of you know about it and it's already been discussed. So I will give you a surface level understanding of a research instrument. And all of you know what is a questionnaire. It is a formalized set of questions for obtaining an information from the respondents. You can keep it structured, you can keep it unstructured. So in a humorous way, we call the questionnaire should be like a kiss. Why? Because it should be short and simple. It is always a researcher's idea. It's always a researcher's talent to put 100 questions in just one single page, right? Using a tab tables, you can use a compound tables, you can use a simple manifold tables. It depends on how do you extract a larger information in a lesser number of papers, right? And a good questionnaire always should be easy to answer, with a proper grammar, no jargons, and only a short questions. Do not say that you know a very fluent English. Don't try to exaggerate with some words which the respondents are not able to understand. Go to the layman level, make it simple so that the respondent is able to give you an information. Now, the basic design of a questionnaire will depend on the researcher wishes to collect an exploratory information or a quantitative information. That segregates your questionnaire as a structured and unstructured questionnaire. Now, talking about the characteristics, I'm sure this has already been discussed for you. How should you have your questionnaire? How should you put your question wordings? How should you arrange the sequence of a questionnaire, right? For example, you cannot talk to the respondent. Initially, you cannot ask the respondents about the number of children, how many children, how many are school going, how many are college going, and then you are asking a question, are you married, right? So you should put the questions in a very sequential format, right? And at the same time, you should develop the questions in questionnaire in such a way that the researcher should have the same interest from the beginning till the end. He should not be having a disinterest in between and say, no, I don't want to give you an information, right? So this is one important thing that one must note. And drafting a questionnaire, of course, there is no hard and fast rules. It only requires the guidelines. There is no clear-cut rules. Have only 250 words. Have only 300 words. Nobody is going to say that. But you should understand there is no hard and fast rule, but it has only a good guidelines that one must follow. So always when you're constructing the questionnaire as a researcher, friends, you should keep your objectives of your research project and your response. See, the beauty of your drafting a question, I will tell you this, always when you draft your research questions, you will decide the research objectives. Once you decide the research objectives, you will decide the hypothesis, right? Now, these three are in sync. Now you know to test those hypotheses, how should you ask the questions in the questionnaire, right? So that you are prepared well in advance. For those hypotheses, I am using chi-square, I am using ANOVA, I am using SEM, structural equation modeling, I am using regression. You should pre-plan your analysis. First and foremost thing you should know, when you're drafting questionnaire, you already have planned your analysis in mind. Now, today's trend is what? You tend to outsource your analysis, right? Your baby, you're giving it to somebody and asking them to nourish it. You understand how good it's that, right? You should, I know, of course, not everybody is skilled enough to know everything, but at least the basic things you should know it. You should be able to, if at all you're meeting a statistician, if at all you're meeting a person who is doing your work for you, you should know what are your objectives and how it has to be translated to the hypothesis and how hypothesis has to be answered, and what is the, you may not know the techniques, but you should know what is the answers that you are expecting well in advance, right? And secondly, reaching out the target respondents. These decides what type of a questionnaire that you are trying to have it. Your questionnaire is a tool, isn't it? It's a research instrument. If you are targeting the top level people and where you cannot meet them, can you send it in the form of a Google form? Right? So in those cases, there should be a different method, the different way of drafting the questions. If at all you're talking to an illiterate, the person who is not able to answer, but you are not going to collect the information, but you're taking the help of an enumerator or a correspondent, then in which language you should draft it. So you have to, you as a researcher, you should keep two things in mind. One is, I will say it is four things in mind: research questions, objectives, hypothesis, target respondents. Once you know this, then your questionnaire can be easily drafted. But I'm sure this has also been discussed. What are the tips for drafting a good questionnaire? Always avoid the complexity, right? Use a simple and conversational language so that the person can understand and give you the response. Avoid ambiguity, be very specific and avoid the confusions. Using a word like adequate, often, avoid it, right? So people will not be able to give you a proper judgment on this. And using a scales, be very specific, whether you are taking the formative scales, reflective scales, the odd scales, balanced scales, unbalanced scales, you should be knowing these things. Then leading and loaded questions, right? So you should avoid leading and loaded questions. What are leading and loaded questions? Which leaves the respondents to answer in a specific way. And loaded questions are those questions where the respondents himself will be confused to answer as the what exactly the researcher wanted. And avoid a double-barreled items. You ask two questions together. For example, is the Coca-Cola tasty and refreshing? Right? You're asking, if a respondent say yes, whether he said an S for the tasty or whether he said S for the refreshing. So you do not have a clarity on this. The next is avoid making assumptions, right? You should avoid making an assumption. You cannot say that the respondent knows everything and then you go and asking the concept. So you should avoid assumptions. At the same time, you should avoid the estimates as well. What are estimates? You should not put the respondents to think, right? So you said, say for example, you're asking the respondents about the age in days, right? The respondent may not be able to give you this kind of an information. So avoid the estimates. So having said this, I'm sure this has also been discussed with you, right? Because research questionnaire is one of an important tool for primary data collection. The questions, you can take a screenshot of this, friends, so that you get a clarity on the what are the type of questions that can be included in the questionnaire. Your questionnaire can be broadly classified as a structured and unstructured. So where in structured, you have a closed-ended questions. Unstructured, you have open-ended questions, right? So open-ended questions always give the respondents a flexibility to answer as in how he wants to answer. Whereas closed-ended questions restricts the respondents to answer it. Now, here one important thing one must understand. If you include a closed-ended questions in the questionnaire, you should do an adequate literature review, right? Because you should know, if I'm asking about an occupation for my target audience, what are the type of an occupations that the target audience really belong to, right? So you have to include it. Say marital status, simply asking married and unmarried is different. Whether are the categories of it, whether it is a divorced single parent, a widow, and so you should be knowing whether should I include it or not based on my target audience. Now that I know that I have included a closed-ended questions, they can be dichotomous, multiple option, scaled response. Under dichotomous, you can have a binary and the normal one. What is binary? Do you smoke? Yes or no. That is binary. Are you married? Yes or no. That is binary. Marital status, married, unmarried, is dichotomous. Is that clear? Binary dichotomous or dichotomous. Under multiple options, yesterday you have already seen how do you code a multiple options, isn't it? Multiple options, you can have multiple option single response, multiple option multi-response. For example, pick one among the following when I'm asking you. Say, for example, I ask you your marital status, right? Or I ask you your educational qualification, right? I give you SSLC, PUC, graduate, postgraduate. Let's assume that you are postgraduate. Will you take on I'm SSLC also, I'm a PUC also, I'm graduate also? You will not do it. What is your highest grade of a, that's why it's on ordinal scale, isn't it? What's the highest grade that you will be giving it? So it's a multiple option, single response. Let's take another example. Multiple option, multi-response. Which newspapers you read among the following? Right. So here I have say Udayavani, I have a Times of the say Deccan Herald, I have a many newspapers I tend to give it. And then under that, if you are reading the Udayavani also, if you are reading Deccan Herald, you will take 2. So that is nothing but multiple option, multi-response, right? So these are multiple. Then we have a scaled responses. Under the scaled responses, you can have comparative skills, you have non-comparative skills. I'm sure by now you have taken a screenshot of the same, right? So under comparative skills, you are trying to compare one option over the other. For example, ranking. You tend to use a ranking scale, isn't it? What do? You compare among the 4 items, rank in the order of 1 to 4 if you give it. You are comparing one option with another option. So it's a comparative scale. What is a non-comparative scales? You are not comparing one option with another, right? Under that, we have 2 important categorization, which normally we tend to use in our research. Graphic rating skills. These are something we normally tend to use it to when you have only one question. For example, whenever you go to a more based on their service, they'll ask you to rate one, which if you are giving a very, if you click on an emoji which shows a teeth and very nice smile, that means you are delighted with the services, isn't it? So if suppose there is a smile which is very sad faces, then it is nothing but you're not happy with the services, something like that, based on a graphics. Itemized rating scales, under that, I'm sure this has also been discussed. You have a Likert scales, you have semantic differential scale, force item scales, important questions, and the staple scales. Now, all these scales are based on they are actually ordinal, but people tend to take it as an interval scales, because they're standardized scales, right? So these are all one holistic idea about what is a questionnaire and how researchers can use questionnaire as a tool for collecting the data. Now coming to the self-administered surveys. Self-administered survey, we have a mail surveys and the fact surveys. As I already told you about this, mail surveys are where you're sending the structured questions, and the response rates are very, very poor in this, right? People, nobody, even you yourself, if you get something from a bank or any organization to give a feedback, nobody will take a response to go back and put it in the post boxes, right? Even if it is a self-stamped or attested and everything, you are not going to take that effort. Fax service, it can happen between the organization because you require a tool called as a fax machines. The fourth one and the last one under the quantitative is a electronic or online surveys, right? Under the electronic or online surveys, you are making use of an internet services, right? Where you can send the questionnaires through the email, right? Or electronic mail, where you can reach out to the large number of a target audience, right? But again, the response rate can be very, very low here, but you can reach a large target audience. So that's the beauty of the email survey. But again, if you have written statements, so whenever in an email survey, the introductory statements play an important role, right? The purpose, the need, the way you request, all those, the introductory mail is very important. The way introductory mail is sent, if it's very catching, then the respondent can feel wow to give you an answer back, right? So that is somewhere, that is how exactly you can catch hold of a respondent to mail you back the answers or a feedbacks or an information. The second is an internet surveys, right? So these are those type of a self-administered questionnaire posted on the websites, where normally by ticking it is already ready-made by ticking. See here, there cannot be an error, because the moment you choose one option, the other options automatically gets disabled. So this is quite largely used, right? Where exactly I have given you an option, one format of it. So these are all website-based surveys. Now the prominent ones to reach a larger target audience, some of the survey tools which is commonly used are these. But friends, I will not be able to give you an advantages and disadvantages, because personally I have not used any of this, right? But I have made a research to understand that these are some of the prominent tools that are available for all of you to reach out to the larger target audience through the internet surveys. Now, lastly, I would like to make a comment here that there is no form of a best form of a survey. Each has its own advantages and disadvantages, but it all depends on the researcher to take up a call which method to be applicable. Now, there is also one method called as a schedule sent to the enumerators. This is popularly used in those type of a surveys when you understand your respondents are illiterates, right? Where a researcher prepares a schedules and tries to answer those schedules by himself, personally meets the respondents and collects the data. Now here there are some organizations who tend to do these type of research surveys where schedules are prepared. Now there will be a question in your mind, what is the difference between a questionnaire and the schedule, right? The questionnaire are those where it can be used as a tool for collecting the data, where researcher himself can go and collect the data, or he can expect the respondent to answer it and drop it back to the researcher, right? So this is one form, and I've told you what are the major ways of drafting the questionnaire. And here we assume that the researcher can use a questionnaire to those people who are literates, right? And it can be a time consuming, because you can have a large number of responses category here. And also sometimes it can be mailed, sometimes it can be asked personally, or you can also ask the respondents to fill it by himself. But the schedules methods are those, it is a short shorter than the research questionnaire, but it is a direct in nature. That is, you are having a direct contact with the respondents, but you are not asking the respondents to fill it, but researcher takes a call. Now here, when you are drafting a schedule, understand researcher can take up a call as how he wants to draft the questions. Normally, when we draft a questionnaire with the Likert scales, we normally try to use the questionnaire with favorable and unfavorable items, because you are trying to ask the respondents to fill it by themselves, right? So that you want to use something called as a lie detectors. But in schedules, you can put everything in one favorable conditions only or unfavorable conditions only, so that your code, since you are collecting the data by them yourself, you can ask the responses and fill it accordingly, right? But this can be sometimes expensive, because the researcher has to go around to too many respondents to collect the data and in personally meet and collect it. So the resources, one of the drawback is that the resources limitations cannot be, can hamper this particular method. Now, talking about the last, how much time I have? Okay, I have enough time. So last topic, I have spoken so far now about the quantitative tools for collecting the primary data, but it's not always a quantitative. There is also a qualitative tools for collecting the primary data, right? So again, under this, we have interview techniques, focus group techniques, case study methods, Delphi technique, experience survey, and observation methods, right? Again, these methods are different from the other one. Here, you are not having a structured questionnaire, right? It depends on the knowledge of the researcher, and you can go in that deeper to collect the data as how you want for your research. Now here, firstly, we will talk about the focus group. Now, what is a focus group interview? It is an unstructured, free-flowing interview which works with a group of a small people and one moderator. Now, why the focus group interviews are important? Say, for example, in our college, we wanted to introduce a new specialization on analytics, right? Now, when we wanted to have a new specialization on analytics, simply we cannot take up a call by we will introduce, chalo, let's all decide to draft a syllabus and we will introduce it, right? We need to know, catering to the need of a student, whether if a business analytics specialization is introduced, then what will be the placements, what happens to the placements, and will the company will recruit those students who are into an analytics? You have to have these kind of, you will be having these kind of questions. So what college does, college will try to collect the people from a different, collect the people who are about 6 to 10 people who are all having a knowledge of statistics, but from the different field, knowledge of analytics, but from different field. Say, for example, one from an industry experts, one who is working on an area of analytics, one who is a subject expert, one who is teaching analytics in a different organization, from the student's point of view, from a company which deals with an analytics. You call these people and collectively take an opinion about these people, and to record all these things, there is a moderator. So why moderator will be there? The moderator should also have the good communication and the skill of recording the information, so that he can put together and take up one decision, should we really introduce analytics or not. So this can happen in the focus group interviews, right? So focus group interviews are not group interviews. Understand this, where moderator asks the questions and people will participate. No, here it is people will give their opinion and based on their experience and tell that whether this is really suitable for a management students or not. So it can happen with respect to the policy decisions. It can happen with respect to an evaluations and so on. So this is the first one, focus group interview, which is a most important tool that is used under the qualitative research. The second is an interview. I've already spoken about this, right? This is also a qualitative. It can come under quantitative. It can be under the qualitative as well, right? Now, under the qualitative, if you consider, there can be many methods. We have personal interviews, telephonic interviews, depth interviews, where you go in depth and go on probing you go in one question you ask and go on probing it to the level that you go on extracting the information so that the same question is asked in a 4 or 5 different ways, right? Projective techniques is where exactly you try to understand the actual behavior of the respondent, right? You try to collect the real behavior of a respondent, when the respondent owns the things and when the respondent do not own a thing. Then comes is the observation method, right? What's an observation method? You observe. Are you in contact with the respondent? You're not in contact with the respondent. But still, with only your eyes, you can collect a lot of informations, right? Now, normally observation methods are used widely in the marketing research, right? Or say whenever you want to study about the animal behavior, right? So, or children behavior. If suppose let's say that I'm manufacturing a nappy diapers for the children, can I prepare a questionnaire for the children and then ask them how do you feel wearing a nappy diapers and so on, right? So it's practically not possible and highly impossible. So in those cases, you observe the children for a certain period of time and then record the responses. So this is also an observation methods. Consumer behavior, right? How much the respondent or a consumer looks into a particular product, or whether what is the respondent feel towards when he comes to the stack. All these things you can observe it. You can observe. Need not be you have to have a person there, but there are various other methods to do this. Generally, in observation method, you do not have the personal contact, but you try to make use of your 5 senses. You see, you smell, you hear, you touch, and you taste, right? So these are the observations through this that you can draw. Sometimes researcher can collect the information by himself, or he can use the tools like CC cameras. You can use the tools like an eye cameras, recorders, and so on to collect the data. But the important thing is what kind of an observation a researcher does, right? There are 2 forms of observation, a quantitative observation and a qualitative observation. Now, you're surprised, isn't it? How it can be a qualitative and how it can be a quantitative observation. So how do you say it's a qualitative and quantitative? Say, for example, I have given you a roses here. Can you make a qualitative observations here? What are qualitative observations? Roses are red in color, right? So what is a quantitative observation? There are 4 roses. There are 6 leaves in it. If you are making an observations in the form of numerical values, then it is a quantitative observations. If you are making an observations with the qualitative attributes, then it is the qualitative observations, right? Say, for example, this. Now, quickly get the answer in the chat box. So what are the qualitative observations that you can make? What are the qualitative observations that you can make with this picture? Blue eyes, beautiful, right? Blue scarf, right? You can make use of, by just looking at the picture, you can make a lot of observations. You don't have to interview that lady, isn't it? By just looking at the picture, you can make a lot of qualitative observation. Tell me, what are quantitative observations? 2 eyes, yes, right? The lady has a 2 eyes is a quantitative observations. Okay, so there are methods for collecting the observations. You can, I'm not again going in detail. Nose you could see? Wow. Okay. Okay, that's an assumption. She will be having 1 nose, right? Okay, anyways, the type of observation methods, I'm not going in detail again. There can be structured observations. You make it clear, very clear what you have to observe. Unstructured observations, some unusual things that happens that also you make a record of it. Disguised, undisguised. The participant knows that the person is being observed is a undisguised method. So participant do not know that the person is observed is a disguised method. Direct, indirect, right? So directly you observe. For example, direct observations is where exactly the respondent knows directly the respondent is being observed. Indirect observations is where exactly normally it is done in the companies. By looking at the growth, you make an observations, right? By looking at the dashboard of the company, you make some observations, right? So these are some observations that you tend to make it. Sales record, you make an observations. Market value, you make an observations, and so on. Human and mechanical observation. If a person is there, say for example ATM machine, right? There is a person who is there to observe the ATM machine, right? So that is called human observations. Mechanical observations is where exactly you tend to use eye cameras or CC cameras, CCTV, voice recorders, and then record it. So again, I'm not going in advantages and disadvantages. They are self-explanatory. And the last methods that we have is an experience. Last, but okay, we have 3 more. So experience survey. So experience surveys are those normally used when you want to collect, when you want to redefine your research tool, or when you want to collect, when you want to set your objectives and so on. What normally we tend to do, you try to go to the person who's already worked in that area, whom you consider a knowledgeable, who really has a practical experience, and collect the data. So this is simply nothing but an experience surveys. Now understand, these are all your exploratory research method techniques, right? Which can also be called as a qualitative research tools. Then next we have is the Delphi techniques, right? So Delphi technique is also another method where it is a group communication method where a panel of experts arrive at one consensus over a series of open-ended questions. So here, Delphi technique is different from the focus group. Here you have a panel, you have an open-ended type of a questions, and then you try to answer those questions and try to, it's simply nothing but the brainstorming, right? You try to collect and finalize on one particular consent. So that is your Delphi technique. And lastly, we have a case study approach. So I don't have to give you details about the case study approach. So all of you know about what exactly is a case study approach. The basic purpose of a case study approach is to obtain information from one or few situations that are similar to researchers' problem situations, right? Now, understanding the case study, the person can understand what can be the repercussions, what can be the solution, what can be the answers, what is the way in which the response, the way in which the same problem can be handled in the organization, right? Say, for example, the worker union negotiation. Suppose if at all you wanted to solve this particular issue in the organization, you can study some good case studies that are available. What is the methodology that they have adopted in that cases, and how exactly they have rectified, and then the similar type of a solution, you can understand the feasibility, whether it can be applicable for your research or not, right? Now, having said this, I come to the end of the sessions where I have given you an idea about the empirical tools for collecting a data, which we can call it as a primary data, but I have given you under the qualitative tools as well as under the quantitative tools. I'm sure I'm on time, isn't it, sir? So we have
exactly.
We have about 8 minutes time. Again, let me give you the final outline or summary of what exactly I have already discussed. Firstly, the first session 5 to 6:30, I already discussed about the sampling techniques, where initially I spoke about the basic terms that we normally use in the sampling, that is the population, the sample, and the parameter, statistic, observation, and elements. Having understood this, I also have discussed about, I also had discussed about the steps involved in the sampling, right? So under that, the first step is to identify the target audience. The second step was to identify the sampling frame, very important, because that is where exactly decides about your entire nature of your sampling design. The third step is choosing your target audience. And the fourth step is choosing the method for selection of samples, either probability or non-probability. And the last method that we had was to determine the sample size. In that, I have given you the clarity on how, firstly, always decide the sample size, assuming your population as an infinite, and then adjust your sample sizes for the finite population. And beautifully, you can find these reasoning from a simple textbook called C.R. Kothari, right? So you don't have to go anywhere else to search for the information. But sampling methodology, you can research on author called Cochrane on survey sampling methods, who have given an idea about how do you decide the sample size for the finite and infinite populations. Then comes is about the second part of our discussions, that is 7 to 8:30. We discussed about the second half of our discussion was on empirical tools for collecting the data, where I spoke about the data collection. Under the data collection, I spoke about the primary data and the secondary data as a segregations, and secondary data was already discussed with you, right? So I'm not connected to that. And the primary data, I have taken the various methods under the 4 different categories as a I have taken under the categories of self-administered survey, the mail surveys, telephonic interview methods, and the internet methods. And that is quantitative collection of a data. And under the qualitative collection of a data, we already discussed in detail about the Delphi techniques, the interview techniques, focus group interviews, and we also discussed about it was a case study methods and so on. So this is the highlight of our what we have already discussed in 3 hours of lectures. So that's all that I've been asked to do it, and whatever, I'm sure I have made a justice for the topic. Now, the last one quest for all of you. Can anybody unmute yourself and read this for me? Can anybody unmute yourself and read this for me? Anybody can take up a call. Sir,
I unmuted them. I unmuted them.
Okay, anybody can take up a lead.
Ma'am?
Yes.
Ashita here.
Okay, Ashita, okay. Tell me, Ashita.
I couldn't believe that I could actually understand what I was reading. The phenomenal power of the human mind, according to a research at Cambridge University. It doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and the last letters in the right place. The rest can be a total mess and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Amazing. Huh? Yeah, and I always thought spelling was important.
Okay, very good, Ashita. And what exactly you can infer from this? Is it not a mess in between? The first word and the last word is perfect, right? The rest is all a mess. So research is also same, right? Research is also same. You should have the right beginning. You should have a right end. In between, if you little mess it up as you're giving your baby to somebody else to do the data analysis and so on, it's all fine. But know that your findings is supporting your arguments in the beginning, right? If that's manageable, you will be able to manage your research well, because confusions are always there. It's okay to be confused in between, but with that, you can be a good researcher, right? You can be a good researcher, but to have a good research ideas, you should be able to observe things. You should be able to question your arguments. You should be able to discover the new answers, and at the same time, learn to record every single details, right? So this is, I conclude